There is a clay object in Oxford that has caused a surprising amount of confusion. It is called the Weld-Blundell Prism, and on its 4 sides is a long list of ancient Mesopotamian kings. At first glance, that sounds fairly ordinary. Ancient civilizations kept lists of rulers all the time. But then you start reading the reign lengths. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, gets 36,000. A little later, Enmenluana is given 43,200 years. These are not modern additions. The numbers really are in the ancient text. That is what makes the Sumerian King List so interesting. It contains names of rulers who may belong entirely to legend, names of rulers who probably lived, and names of rulers we can independently identify from inscriptions. And somehow they are all placed into one continuous sequence, as if the same kind of history connects them. So the real question is not simply whether anybody lived for 30,000 years. There is no evidence that they did. The more useful question is why ancient scribes wrote the numbers this way, and what kind of history they thought they were recording. The object most people associate with the list is the Weld-Blundell Prism in the Ashmolean Museum. It is a 4-sided clay prism, about 20 centimeters tall. The writing is arranged in 8 columns, 2 on each side, and the text has to be read by turning the prism as the list continues. It was probably written at Larsa in southern Mesopotamia around the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. That is already an important point, because the prism was not made in the age of the earliest kings it describes. The scribe who copied it was looking back across many centuries, and the prism is not the only version. Several manuscripts of the Sumerian King List survive, and they do not all agree. Some names appear in one copy and not another. Some reign lengths change. The order can differ in places. The famous section about the kings before the flood is not equally preserved across the whole manuscript tradition. That means we should not imagine one original state document that was updated without interruption from the beginning of civilization. What survives is a scribal tradition. It was copied, edited, and transmitted over time. The text itself begins with an idea rather than a date. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven, and then kingship was in Eridu. For the people copying this text, kingship was more than the fact that a particular man controlled a city. It was an institution with divine legitimacy, something that could belong to one city and later move to another. Eridu comes first. Alulim rules there for 28,800 years, followed by Alalgar for 36,000. Then Eridu is defeated, and kingship moves to Bad-tibira. At Bad-tibira, the numbers remain enormous. Enmenluana is given 43,200 years. Enmengalana receives 28,800. Dumuzid the shepherd receives 36,000. From there, kingship moves again, first to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. Before the flood, the list gives 8 kings in 5 cities and a combined reign of 241,200 years. After that comes a very short statement. The flood swept over. The list does not stop to tell the full flood story. There is no long description of a boat, animals, or a surviving family here. Other Mesopotamian texts do that. In the king list, the flood mainly works as a dividing line. Once it is over, kingship descends from heaven again and is established at Kish. If we were expecting the numbers to become realistic at this point, they do not. The early kings of Kish still receive reigns of hundreds or more than 1,000 years. Jushur is given 1,200. Itana, who is also known from Mesopotamian legend, is assigned a reign of well over 1,000 years in the surviving tradition. So there is no simple moment where myth suddenly ends and reliable history begins. That transition is much messier. One of the most useful names for seeing this is Enmebaragesi, a king of Kish. In the king list, he is given a reign of 900 years and is said to have defeated Elam. 900 years is obviously not a believable human reign. But Enmebaragesi is important because his name is not confined to this later king list. An early inscription preserves the name Mebaragesi together with the title King of Kish. That gives historians something solid to work with. It does not prove every story about him, and it certainly does not make the 900 years literal. What it shows is that the king list can preserve the name of a real ruler while also attaching an impossible reign length to him. That single example warns us against 2 easy mistakes. We cannot dismiss everything in the list as fiction simply because some of the numbers are impossible. But we also cannot assume that once one ruler turns out to be historical, every detail attached to him must be factual. The text moves next through rulers associated with Uruk, and this is where the boundary between literature and history becomes even harder to see. We encounter Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, Dumuzid, the fisherman, and Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is given a reign of 126 years. Most people know Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but the Sumerian material around him is older and more complicated than that famous Babylonian version. He appears in several literary compositions as a king of Uruk. The King List also places him in a dynastic sequence. That does not prove the literary Gilgamesh exactly as the stories describe him. It does suggest that later Mesopotamian scribes treated him as part of their remembered royal past. Whether there was a historical king behind the tradition remains plausible, but not securely demonstrated in the same way as rulers known from contemporary royal inscriptions. This is where the King List becomes genuinely useful, because it forces us to keep different kinds of evidence separate. A literary text can preserve memory without being a biography. A later King List can preserve genuine names without being a perfect chronology. Even a contemporary inscription only tells us what that particular object can support. It does not automatically confirm every later story told about the ruler. When historians reconstruct early Mesopotamia, they compare all of these things instead of treating one source as the final answer. The structure of the King List itself gives another clue about its purpose. It repeatedly says that one city was defeated and kingship was carried to another. Kish gives way to Uruk. Uruk gives way to Ur. Then kingship moves again through other cities and dynasties. If you only had this text, you might imagine that southern Mesopotamia always had one legitimate king at a time. But that is not how the political landscape actually worked. Different cities could have rulers at the same time, and their dynasties overlapped. A king might dominate neighboring territory without ending every other local line of rulers. Alliances changed, wars broke out, and cities rose or declined independently. The King List smooths that complicated world into one sequence. That is why many historians read it partly as a statement about legitimacy. The important thing is not just who ruled, but who possessed kingship at a given moment in the story. It is a very different way of organizing the past from a modern chart showing several kingdoms side by side. There is also an important omission. Lagash was one of the major city-states of early Mesopotamia, and some of its rulers are extremely well documented. Eannatum left the Stele of the Vultures. Other rulers of Lagash left inscriptions about temples, warfare, land, and administration. Yet the rulers of Lagash are largely absent from the main sequence of the Sumerian King List. That would be strange if the purpose of the document were simply to include every important ruler. It makes much more sense if the list was constructing a particular version of political history. The same selective logic helps explain why the text could become useful to later dynasties. The Weld-Blundell Prism continues down to rulers of Isen, close to the period when the prism itself was copied. So the story begins with kingship descending from heaven, passes through the flood, then through famous cities and dynasties, and eventually reaches rulers much closer to the scribe's own world. That creates a line of legitimacy. A ruler of Isen could be placed at the end of a chain that began in the age of Eridu. We should be careful with the word propaganda, because it can make the document sound more modern than it is. But the political purpose is difficult to miss. The list organizes the past in a way that makes kingship look continuous, even when real political history was not. The numbers are part of that construction, and this is where Mesopotamian mathematics becomes relevant. Scribes in Mesopotamia worked with a sexagesimal system based on 60. They were very comfortable with large multiples of 60, and some of the antediluvian reigns fit neatly into that mathematical world. 3,600 is 60 times 60. Alulim's 28,800 years equal 8 times 3,600. Alalgar's 36,000 equal 10 times that number. Enmenluana's 43,200 equal 12 times it. So these are not just random large numbers. There is structure behind them. But that does not give us a complete translation key. People have tried to reduce the reigns to normal human lengths by suggesting that the word translated as years should really be understood as months, or that the figures encode another kind of calendar. Others have proposed astronomical schemes or hidden mathematical formulas. None of those ideas has produced a simple solution that historians broadly accept for the whole list. There are also modern claims that the long reigns describe non-human rulers, ancient visitors from space, or people with lifespans created by lost technology. The King List does not say any of that. Those explanations come from much later attempts to make the numbers literal while also making them compatible with a modern sense of physical reality. The ancient text gives us enormous reigns. It does not explain them in biological terms. The safest conclusion is that the numbers had meaning within Mesopotamian scribal culture, but we do not know exactly how every number was meant to be understood. One possibility is that the huge reigns place the earliest kings in a remote, almost cosmic age. Another is that large sexagesimal values had symbolic or scholarly significance. The figures may also reflect older local traditions that were combined when the list took shape. These possibilities do not cancel each other out. What we should avoid is pretending that one neat formula has solved the entire problem. There is another detail in the list that helps keep the discussion grounded. Much later, after the Akkadian Empire falls into crisis and the Gutian period appears, some reigns become very short. Tirigan, for example, is given only 40 days. That is worth remembering because the same tradition that could give Alulim more than 28,000 years could also record a reign of 40 days. The scribes were perfectly capable of expressing short, ordinary spans of time. Their number system was not forcing them to produce gigantic reigns. As the list moves toward better documented periods, the numbers generally become much more human. Sargon of Akkad appears in the list, and here we are dealing with an unquestionably historical ruler. His empire is known from inscriptions, administrative documents, later copies of royal texts, and the broader archaeological record. But even Sargon shows why the king list has to be used carefully. Different manuscripts do not always give exactly the same reign length. The numbers for later rulers can vary too. That is another reminder that the text was transmitted by scribes rather than preserved as an untouched original. The list is still extremely valuable. It preserves dynastic relationships, city traditions, royal names, and a framework that can be compared with other evidence. But historians do not simply copy its chronology into a modern timeline. They test it against everything else that survives. If a king appears in a contemporary inscription, that matters. If two rulers are known to have been contemporaries, even though the king list places their dynasties one after another, that matters too. If a city with well-attested rulers is omitted, that tells us something about the list's priorities. When one manuscript gives a different number from another, the disagreement becomes part of the history of the text itself. There are also small details that make the list feel less like a grand myth and more like a scribal compilation built from very different materials. Some rulers are identified by occupations. We find shepherds, fishermen, craftsmen, and officials. One of the most unusual entries is Kugbao, a woman described as a tavern keeper who became ruler of Kish. The list gives her a reign of 100 years. Whether that number is reliable is another question, but the description itself is striking. In a document that begins with kingship descending from heaven and rulers lasting tens of thousands of years, someone can still be remembered by a profession that belonged to ordinary urban life. That is typical of the king list. It keeps putting different kinds of past beside one another. Primeval rulers, figures known mainly from literature, historical kings, political traditions, and old local memories all ended up in the same composition. The result is not a clean historical record, but it is not meaningless either. In some ways, that makes the document more useful. If the king list were simply a list of accurate dates, it would tell us when rulers reigned. Instead, it also tells us how Mesopotamian scribes thought about rulership itself. Kingship comes from the divine world and moves from city to city. Defeat can cause a city to lose it. The past is arranged as one chain rather than several competing political histories. The earliest age is measured on a scale far beyond normal human life, while later periods gradually become more recognizable. That is a historical idea, even when the chronology is not historical in the modern sense. So did Alulim really rule for 28,800 years? There is no evidence that he did, and no independent evidence has established Alulim as a historical king. Enmebarjesi is a different case. There is no reason to accept his 900-year reign, but an early inscription gives us strong reason to accept that a ruler of Kish with that name actually existed. Gilgamesh is less certain. Ancient tradition consistently treated him as a king of Uruk, and a historical ruler behind the stories is possible, but the evidence is not enough to turn the literary character into a securely documented biography. By the time we reach Sargon, we are firmly inside recoverable political history, even though the king list still has to be checked against other sources. That gradual change is the real story. The Sumerian King List does not take us from fiction to fact in one clean step. It moves through layers of memory. At the beginning, kings belonged to a world before the flood and reigned for impossible spans of time. Later come figures preserved mainly through literature and tradition. Then we reach rulers such as Enmebarajesi, where inscriptions begin to give us independent support. Eventually, the list arrives at kings and dynasties surrounded by much stronger documentary evidence. The text never tells us where we should draw the line. We have to do that ourselves, using evidence that survives outside the list. That is why the Weld-Blundell Prism is more interesting than the claim that ancient kings lived for thousands of years. The impossible numbers are what attract attention, but they lead to a much better question. How did Mesopotamian scribes join a remote legendary past to rulers and cities that belong to real political history? They did not separate myth, political memory, literature, and chronology in exactly the way we do. And they were not writing for us. They were working inside a culture where kingship had religious meaning. Cities competed for prestige, old stories could carry political authority, and a learned scribe could place a primeval ruler and a recent dynasty inside the same long tradition without feeling any need to explain the boundary between them. The Weld-Blundell Prism preserves that tradition in clay. Its earliest kings cannot be verified. Some of its later kings can. Its reign lengths move from impossible numbers toward much more plausible ones. Its dynasties simplify a political landscape that was far more complicated, and its surviving manuscripts disagree in places. None of that makes the document useless. It makes it exactly the kind of source historians have to work with. Valuable, selective, imperfect, and shaped by the people who copied it. The interesting part is not that the Sumerian King List fails to behave like a modern database. Nobody writing it expected it to. What matters is that inside a text beginning with kingship descending from heaven, we can eventually recognize people who left their own names on real objects. That is where the Sumerian King List becomes difficult to classify. It is not simply mythology, and it is not a reliable chronological record. It is a document in which those two worlds overlap, sometimes within the entry for the very same king.